Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmate here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk about the quick gameplay thoughts that was posted where Riot went on a deep dive in terms of item choice and selection, specifically focusing on their mythic items, though they did touch on legendaries a little bit, and kind of talking about how well they're doing on their mythic item diversity so far. Now remember, Riot's original goal was to ensure that champions only buy the same mythic in 75% of their games. Currently, 88% of the roster meets this goal, which is an incredible number, especially when you consider that in the previous item system, only 20% of the roster would have met that goal. That meant in most games, 80% of the roster was buying the exact same first couple of items or the exact same primary items in every single build. So this is already a huge step forward, but Riot did post basically post a bunch of graphs that show the rate at which champions buy items and which roles in particular have champions that could use some help. Now, Riot are trying to make sure that every single champion in the game is able to meet that sort of 75% or less number, which is not currently, it hasn't currently happened, and today I kind of wanted to go through this deep dive and give my thoughts, but also to touch on why this isn't really possible, especially given some of the champions that are having issues in the current item system, finding items that really meet their needs. Let's start with the easy ones first. In the tank class, no one violates this clause, which is super good. Every tank has options, and every tank mythic has specific areas where it can be bought. Every tank mythic generally feels usable on every single tank. This is a really, really good thing for them to have, and tank mythics do feel interchangeable. When I play tanks, I always consider which mythic is best for the job, rather than always trying to buy the exact same one. There's never really a situation where I say, 100% I go Sunfire Cape on this champion in every single game. There's always flexibility for me to say, well, is this a Sunfire game? Maybe I should do something else. Maybe I should even swap my mythic late game because a different item will give me better benefits. So I do really like where that's at for the tank slot. In supports, there is only one violator, and that is Yuumi, which is interesting because I feel like Yuumi could also make use of Lock of the Iron Solari or Shirelia's Battle Song, as opposed to going Renewer in every single game. It is weird to me that that's the item she goes. I know there are some cheesy things you can do, like spamming W on allied champions in the middle of a fight in order to just proc Renewer off cooldown, because technically you're casting a spell every time you do that, and W has no cooldown when used like that. So there are some cheesy things that Yuumi can do with it, but that doesn't feel like it would be enough for her to want to build the same item every time. I'm going to chalk it up to essentially players not thinking about their decisions and instead just making an arbitrary decision based on what they think would be really good, because I don't see anything that would hard bind Yuumi to Moonstone Renewer. But either way, I'm hoping it's just a phase and Yuumi players are able to sort of expand their horizons and do something a little different. In Assassins, there's also only one failure in Kha'Zix. He only ever buys the Duskblade of Drakthar, whereas most of the other assassin items are built fairly regularly by other champions. Again, with Kha'Zix, it feels more like a perception thing. I feel like he can make use of items like Prowler's Claw in order to close the gap or work as sort of a follow-up gap closer. So when you jump on someone, they try to flash or dash away, you Prowler's Claw after them. I feel like there are a lot of opportunities in which Kha'Zix could get some value from those items, where he's just sort of not doing it because it's hard to pass on something like Duskblade of Drakthar. I will acknowledge this. So hopefully, that's just a phase. So again, that's sort of a situation where these champions so far feels like they do actually have options. Moving on to some situations where champions don't really feel like they have options is in the AD carry category, where there are 3 failures. Now, Vayne with Kraken Slayer, that's not really a surprise to me because of how synergistic she is with every 3 auto attacks doing something. I'm surprised she doesn't consider Shield Bow more often given her short range and need for survivability, but I guess it does kind of sort of make sense that she wants to go for just the straight damage and try to abuse that from there. So I don't know, I feel like she could make use of Shield Bow, so again, it might be a perception thing. Players I know really favor damage over any other stat possible, so with her having this hyper synergy with every 3 hits, it does kind of make sense why she would maybe be valuing Kraken Slayer over everything else, but I do feel like, especially if we ever saw her in pro play, she would be considering Shield Bow a lot more often. In a similar fashion is Jhin, who, to be fair, doesn't really feel like he synergizes well with the other AD carry itemization. He literally can't build Kraken Slayer for comparison because there's just no possible way a champion who can only auto-attack 4 times in a row would ever get value from something that only triggers every 3 auto-attacks. Like, the math and the brain power needed to figure out how you're going to make that work just feels like it would be way too complex and way too complicated. But it does surprise me, again, that he doesn't buy Shield Bow, given that he's an immobile champion. He needs to really try to survive in team fights. He gets a lot of value out of high damage and lots of lifesteal, that sort of a thing. It sort of surprises me that he doesn't buy Shield Bow that much. It does feel like that should be an option, especially given that he's not hardbound to Gale Force. I feel like there are other options for him, even outside of that, but either way, that's where he's at right now. And again, it feels like a perception thing. The biggest thing here is Samira, who is hardbound to Crimson Shieldbow, and it's hard to fault her. This is an item that gives her lifesteal and critical strike chance, which are two items that are just like absolutely, or two stats that are absolutely amazing on Samira. Like, that's all she wants in her build, period. And this gives her both of them, as well as a passive that lets her stay alive longer in team fights when she goes for the dash in to press R to try and get the first kill, to reset, right? Like, Shieldbow enables her to do all of that, and it's really hard to sell yourself on things like Kraken Slayer when your ultimate can't proc that and your Q can't proc that, or Gale Force, because yeah, that's an aggressive item, but you're not getting lifesteal off of it when you could be building a shield bow. So in this situation, it feels like the item is just too good for Samira in particular, and that there's no real way for Riot to unbind Samira from shield bow unless they either unduly nerf it, or if they try to really do some crazy things like letting Samira Q and R proc on hit effects, but then you'll have some issues like Riot had with Katarina when she was allowed to do that. So just kind of some problems with how you would actually balance this around. And this is where the item system, I think, and Riot's goal is kind of start breaking down, because, like, I don't think it's a problem necessarily that Samira does buy the same Mythic in all of these games, given how hard she synergizes with it, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that this item, which is usable for a lot of the cast, is also near mandatory on this character. Now, to be fair, I don't think it is mandatory. I think she can go with other options if she so desires, but because Shield Bow gives her so many advantages, it's hard for her to ever sort of justify going something else. However, that's not to say that Riot don't have situations where an item is too good to ever not buy. In the mages category, we have 6 failures, which is the biggest category of failure for Riot's champions, and a big portion of this is because of the strength of Liandry's Anguish. Now, Brand, Cassiopeia, Malzahar, and Zyra are all exploiting Liandry's Anguish, as well as Lilia, who is over in the AP, Assassin, and Fighter category. And I feel like the problem here is not with the champions. I feel like it's a problem with the items itself, because Liandry's was already an item that these champions were going to be building in the first place. It gives them basically extra damage per instance of damage, right? So if you are a dot mage, right, if you're doing damage over time, like, you just absolutely love this item. There's no real way around it. Like, it just gives you everything you want. It gives you more damage per damage. And so now in the old system, because it didn't give you mana and it gives you health, which you don't necessarily care about, it's a little harder to justify as a first build. But now that it gives you mana, like, there's absolutely no reason to not buy this item. Like, I'm sorry, on these champions, they just don't have a choice, especially when you consider that, you know, things like Everfrost, I don't feel like are particularly effective on these champions in particular. I feel like Everfrost is just so narrow in what its niche actually is, especially given its very small range. Like, there are very few champions, I feel, that actually get value out of doing something like going for the Everfrost build. And Luden's Tempest, I think, is good, but I feel like it just, again, when you look at Liandry's Anguish, it's just so hard to pass up on it and say, well, what situation do I actually want do I actually want Luden's Tempest in comparison to Liandry's Anguish, right? Like, that's the problem I think I'm generally having with that item, is that there are just so few situations in which you would go the other one for these champions in particular. So in general, I think this is a problem, and even if Riot nerf the crap out of Liandry's Anguish, it's just hard to see them ever willingly building another Mythic unless it just happens to be an unavoidably good buy. So I don't know what the solution is. I don't know if Riot will simply say, okay, it's fine that they build this item in every single game, or if they try to create another mage item that can maybe compete in that same sort of slot. But it does feel like it's going to be very difficult for them to actually get that item into a good situation. And sort of a situation where they just kind of have to bite the bullet and say, yeah, these champions are going to build Liandry's in every game, and essentially there's nothing we can do to stop it unless we replace Liandry's with another mana item and sort of say, well, you have to build something else instead. Moving on to Fighters, which has a couple of failures here, which, again, these all kind of make sense. Aatrox, Olaf, and Rost are hardbound to Goredrinker because it does everything they want it to, and again, this is sort of a situation where Fighters have the most Mythics out of any class, but they just really only ever want to buy the same items, right? Like, if you consider about every other option that they have, right, like Sheen procs, Aatrox, Olaf, they don't really need Sheen procs with Sunderer. They don't need positioning with Stridebreaker because they sort of have that in spades, and basically no one needs the amount of attack speed that Trinity Force is going to give, which I think is a problem with the item itself. Trinity Force is just so narrow in terms of which champions want to actually build it that a lot of the old guard fighters who built it as sort of a catch-all good item now basically can't make use of it in the same way that they did before. Which is weird, because then Riot go on to call out Garen and Darius as not champions who have very good broad breadth in the kinds of items that they build, but it makes sense that they only want to build things like Stridebreaker because of their limited mobility, right? Like Aatrox doesn't need it because he has a dash, right? He's able to get in, he can press R and run you down. Garen and Darius, though, they have to have some degree of mobility in order to get in and stick to targets, so it makes sense why they want Stridebreaker, but even these champions aren't breaking it, right? As opposed to Aatrox and Rost, who are always building Gore Drinker in these games. So again, I don't know what the fix is here necessarily. It feels like these champions just don't have another option, and because Gore Drinker does everything they want it to, and the other items just don't have a compelling enough reason for them to build them. Now, weirdly, there are two champions in the fighter category that I'm not sure why they're hardbound to the Mythic they are. One of them, which is Rek'Sai, bound to Prowler's Claw. I don't get that. It feels like she should be able to make use of Gore Drinker or Trinity Force or Divine Sunder in certain situations. So not quite clear on why she loves Prowler's Claw so much, but that's a bit of a weird one that I would chalk up to maybe just players going for raw damage over everything else. And Jace is apparently hardbound to Eclipse. Given his traditional matchups, that kind of makes sense. I could see some situations where he would want maybe Sunder, but the problem is Eclipse does % max HP damage, which is also what Sunder does, so Jace can build it in the tank matchup regardless. So this may end up being yet another situation where a champion just has an item that kind of does what they want it to do, and there aren't really reasons for them to build anything else. And that, I believe, is just about it for the champion classes. So a lot of useful information here in a lot of situations where I just feel like the champions don't have good enough options, or there's just an item that does literally everything they want it to do, and there's no reason for them to ever build something else. To touch on legendaries real quick, it surprises me that Collector is in the top 2 most built items. I feel like it's super niche, and it feels like you really need to commit to a very specific build in order to make that item work. It's not just kind of a generic catch-all good item, but it's in the top 2, so a lot of players are really valuing it. I do expect that number to come down, though, as players sort of realize the power of defensive options. And Zhonya's being at the top does not surprise me at all. I feel like that's a super flexible item that fits a lot of good categories and can go in a lot of different champions. And items further down the list are either super situation dependent, things like Silvermere Dawn or Mikhail's Crucible. Well, you're only going to buy those if you have situations where you need to remove enemy crowd control, so it kind of makes sense why that's not a very common item to build. And Sanguine Blade and Wit's End, those are the items that we should be watching, because those are items that maybe don't have a niche anymore, or they're not heavily targeted enough. I don't really know a situation in which I would build Wit's End. I can think of maybe 1 or 2 champions that want Sanguine Blade, but not a tremendous amount, not an item I would even build in every single game. So it does kind of feel like these items in particular are ones that Riot should be paying attention to and making sure that they can either tweak or buff in a way so that players can and want to build these items more importantly. But anyways, those are just kind of my thoughts on the new item system here, guys, and what Riot were saying about the rate at which these items are being bought. Let me know down in the comments if you guys have any thoughts about this subject, or if you guys know why Rek'Sai is building Prowler's Claw. I would love to hear your thoughts on that down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.